Singularity.
My name is Nicola, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoyed this podcast, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. Number one is you can simply go to iTunes and write a brief review. That would really help me out. Number two is you can go to interviewthefuture.com and simply make a donation. Given that 95% of my income has been from keynote speaking, and the last keynote I did in Panama was on February the 4th, and I don't see any other ones coming on the horizon, it would also really make a difference. At any rate, welcome to Singularity FM, everyone. And we are in for a treat today because today our guest on this podcast is Glen Hiemstra. Glen is perhaps the most experienced futurist that I know of currently at the moment, with probably approaching 40 years of experience in the field. He's also the author of multiple books on futurism, and you can find more both about Glen and his work on futurist.com. A very easy domain to remember, and that would also kind of date Glen that he was really one of the pioneers and one of the first people in the business because he managed to get futurist.com. Anyway, that's a long way of saying, Glen Hiemstra, welcome to Singularity FM.
Thank you, Nicola. It's nice to be here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Fantastic, Glen. I've been doing a deep dive into everything about Glen Hiemstra for the last 5 days, I think, and I'm also very stoked and super looking forward to our conversation. But let's presume that I've never learned anything about you ever before, and I haven't seen or read any of your work. And I were to meet you in the good old days somewhere at a conference or at a futurist event, and I were to ask you, who is Glen Hiemstra? How would you introduce yourself in a sentence or two?
That's challenging, actually. I would say that have been for many years a professional futurist, founder of Futurist.com, and I really focus on, and have for all these years, focus on working with enterprises of various types to help them define, especially a preferred future for themselves, and to understand more clearly how they might be able to move toward it. So that's been my life's work since and a very early career as a college professor. So founder of Futures.com is the key phrase for understanding me.
Very cool. And if I were to make this even more challenging and ask you to kind of explain who you are in a sentence or less without having the opportunity to use the word futurist, how would you do that? Who is Glen Hiemstra in a few words?
Glen Hiemstra is a person interested in how whole systems work, trying to grasp the past, present, and future, and kind of a whole picture of how things fit together. And I kind of have this constant desire to understand why things happen, how things happen from a holistic perspective. And that's been true since I was a young kid.
Very interesting. And we're going to go all into that, but perhaps you already mentioned several interesting terms such as futurist and preferred future. So let's break it and take it sort of a step by step here. And let's start first with, what is a futurist?
To me, a futurist is one who grasps the concept that we as human beings have this capacity to remember, understand the past, to live fully in the present, and to anticipate and dream about the future. And what a futurist does is to sort of ratchet those human abilities, those natural human abilities, up one level, and turn it into a profession, a something that you really seek to do at a professional level, so that you maximize this human capacity to remember, to live, and to anticipate and dream, and then put that together in a way that leads to a hopefully a better world, and hopefully a good life for yourself.
You know, there's two schools of thought here when it comes to futurists and futurism. One is the sort of a hardcore professional, man on the stage, expert kind of he's there and we're all down here kind of view. And the other one is, and according to that first view, basically leave the future to the futurists, and the rest of the population should basically follow the experts, just like any other scientist, etc., or expert in any particular field. Now, the other view is a lot more democratized and decentralized. The other view is that says something like, and because I'm kind of Canadian here in Canada, I'll use a Canadian metaphor. The other view would say, well, look, Wayne Gretzky was a famous futurist. Why? Because he said the key to his success was that he didn't skate where the puck was, but where the puck was going to be, which in the field of hockey, in that professional sports context, is a kind of an exercise of futurism. You had to sort of anticipate where the puck would be so that you're best positioned to benefit from that and to score a goal, or to prevent a goal to be scored in your own side. So which school of thought do you embrace and why?
Well, if I have to choose, I choose the democratizing side. But I suppose, as a systems thinker, I try to put these things together. On the democratizing side, I've often said to organizations that I've worked with or audiences that I've spoken to, as you do as a keynote speaker, that one of my goals at the end of the engagement is that everybody walks out the door and thinks of themselves as a kind of amateur futurist, somebody who's now capable of thinking about the future in a new and more effective way. And I have been hesitant to embrace the over professionalization of the futures field, which has, I think, been the trend. This may not be quite right, but it seems like the trend of the last 20 years or so has been to try to define the futures field in a more and more professional kind of way, more and more academic kind of way, and to, in a sense, and sometimes quite actively, as a matter of fact, try to create delimiters or boundaries around who gets to be a futurist and who doesn't get to be a futurist. And I understand the desire to have a professional credential and the value of that. Uh, and and when somebody asks me how do I become a futurist, the first thing I tell them is, well, there are some schools that you can go to, and there are certificate programs and so on. You can train in order to acquire these skills and these perspectives. So I think that that's a very valuable thing. But when I'm working with a group, I'm really on the democratizing side. I really want them to start thinking like a futurist, and in some certain sense, think themselves as a futurist, somebody who's concerned about future generations, who wants to learn kind of from deep history about how things work and so on. So perhaps I'm somewhere in the middle, but I lean toward the democratizing side while recognizing the value of professional credentials and in fact encouraging people to go get professional credentials when that's appropriate for them to do that.
Hmm. I have to say, I feel the same way, even though I'm leaning even more so on the democratizing side, simply because I know of many futurists historically who have missed amazing sort of phenomenons and events, many experts in many fields, and the, I mean, the list is endless. I even watched a whole documentary on the topic where they were saying that a monkey throwing darts or flipping a coin, looking at the 20th century major events, would have had similar, or at least, or maybe even better success than the experts. And I mean, you're a former political science student, and you know, like me, even more so than me, because you're of a previous generation. One great example of failure of futurism was, for example, the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, no one of the experts who had decades and decades of experience and expertise of the Soviet Union, and they all kind of missed it. It all happened very fast and as a shock, and especially perhaps the relatively peaceful nature of the collapse of that sort of gargantuan empire, one of the greatest military powers. So yeah. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, well, number one, I've got a piece of the Berlin Wall sitting right up there on the windowsill.
Wow.
Yeah, which I didn't collect myself. Somebody who was in Berlin brought it back to me because they knew that I was interested in it.
Wow.
Yeah, and that was an amazing event. Now, in retrospect, of course, it's quite possible to see all the steps that were leading up to it, which
Sure.
is actually one of the things that good futurists should do is try to really understand these historical sequences and how they led to misperceptions of the future and the mistakes that we make in anticipating the future. But that was an amazing historical event. I remember talking with my mother, and she immigrated from Holland to the United States in 1937, and was born in 1920, lived to be 90. So she saw a lot that happened in the 20th century into here in the early 21st century. And I remember when she said, I can believe almost everything that happened in the 20 in my lifetime, airplanes and computers and all of these kinds of things. But she said the thing that really surprised me was when the Berlin Wall came down. She said, I never thought that I would ever see something like that. And so it's a more sociological, political, um, therefore, an event that has many more variables impacting it that make it much harder to anticipate. But still, I think, it doesn't take much unpacking of what was going on in the Gorbachev era and even in the era before that to see that this was coming, that this was very, very likely to happen. Um, but you're right. But experts. This is a problem, I think, for the academic futures field. At least certainly a challenge for the academic futures field, which is the more you, um, the more you create this field of expertise. Of course, in academia, that you become more and more and more specialized, and in a certain sense, your field of view becomes smaller and smaller, which is ironic given that you're in the future studies field, or in today's language, the strategic foresight field. And you find yourself looking at smaller and smaller and narrower points of view rather than the other way around, which you would think would be associated with our field. But that's been the traditional problem of all academic fields is that people become more and more specialized. The nature of the whole academic requirement, writing theses and writing dissertations and so on, sort of requires you to become more and more specialized. And so that's a constant danger in academe. And I don't know that future studies has fallen into that all that much, but it certainly has become characteristic of our field more than it would have been 30 years ago or so.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's one of the reasons why I feel very uncomfortable when someone's calling me a futurist. Because first, I want it to be a more sort of decentralized and democratized thing. And maybe you can even go as far as claiming that one of the things that makes our species unique is our ability to contemplate the future. Homo sapiens, that is. So that's one reason. And another reason is having all those kind of famous failures behind it, and the fact that expertise, while very useful, and I always, like you, recommend self-education and self-improvement as a never-ending pursuit. And yet I'm constantly aware and humbled by the gargantuan failure of the past, and perhaps none more notable than Francis Fukuyama, who not only didn't foresee the collapse of the Soviet Union, but then went on famously to proclaim that that was actually the end of history. And I mean, I couldn't imagine one kind of a shocking turn of event that no one foresaw, then only to be topped off by another prediction that is utterly misplaced.
Yeah, that was interesting. I clearly remember when that happened. And it had certainly kind of an emotional appeal to it, to think that we've arrived,
Yeah.
that
We're the pinnacle.
democracy and capitalism as currently understood, where everything has been headed all along, and now we're there, and we'll make incremental progress in these two areas from now on. But we've arrived, and then that to be um, overturned really quickly was a bit of a shock, and it raises an interesting question about the cyclical nature of history, which is another interesting debate, I think, for those who are interested in the future to engage in, is what you know does history operate in cycles? Does it operate in spirals? Is it just a linear progression? Um, what are the dangers that we'll fall back into some kind of pre-scientific age? All of those kinds of things Um, but and all of those are very different from the concept that we're at the end of history and we've arrived and there's nowhere else to go other than small incremental changes.
Right. And speaking of history, from a sort of a holistic point of view, what do you make of that kind of cliodynamics, Turchin's idea of cliodynamics? Because you're talking about whether history rhymes or repeats itself. What do you make of cliodynamics? I even read an article by Turchin written around 2010 or so, where he allegedly kind of predicted the current polarization and sort of a civil confrontation within the United States and all of that. Whereabouts do you fall?
Well, I have to say that I've only just become familiar with Turchin and cliodynamics. And so I probably don't know it as well as you do. And it's a really interesting concept. In fact, I was thinking of him as I was just mentioning cycles. I used to talk about the Kondratiev cycles a lot in as related to economics, and the Turchin idea that there are these very long wave cycles, highly predictable. Ebbs and flows in the nature of a society based on basically the size of the elite class and whether there's enough opportunity for them. What I don't like about it is the division of classes and the dependence of history on just that. That strikes me as a little bit limited. Um, but and I probably need to understand his work a little bit more. But what does catch my attention is the idea that there are deep cycles, even and it's quite obvious when you look at other species, which he does, and he came out of the field of biology and ecology, and when you look at other species, we totally accept well there are cycles in population growth and population decline, and so on, and we just sort of accept that that's normal, and why we would think that would be necessarily different for the human species is interesting. Other than that, we have this brain power to anticipate the future, learn from the past, and so on, which could make us unique if we really know how to engage that power. So, bottom line is, I think it is something really worth paying attention to for the futures field, and I actually intend to study it a little bit more here in upcoming months to get a little bit more familiar with it. Um, I think it's intriguing.
Yeah, I invited him. Oh, I have to share. I'm personally extremely skeptical, especially after reading his original 2010 piece, where it was sufficiently vague and ambiguous that you certainly, in my opinion, couldn't call it a prediction. You can say that he kind of got the shape of events right for a number of reasons. Whether that was a coincidence or not is a whole other debate. I've had cases on my podcast where in 2013 I was having a conversation with Chris Habels Gray, and then we kind of the two of us predicted the supposedly predicted the not only the global pandemic, but I even blurted, "Oh, I just even read that the coronavirus is extremely dangerous." Right. So was
Wow.
that a prediction in 2013 in my podcast? And of course, the name of my podcast is Interview the Future. So I can go and start making claims. Yes, I foresaw it. But the reality is absolutely not. We kind of mentioned it in a conversation as one potential future scenario. And to be honest, I had forgotten about it until I rewatched it 7 years later. And I was even surprised of my own self. So was that a prediction? I don't consider that a prediction at all. That was just a lucky guess.
Yeah. Well, that prediction, which was a good one, or Turchin's work. What one could argue that what it neglects is the ability of human beings to make choices once they understand the situation that they're in more clearly. He has a certain inevitability to the patterns that he suggests, um, which he believes have been repeated many times in history, and therefore, in a certain sense, we don't have a choice. But my bias has always been that the future is, in fact, this is a phrase I've often used, that the future is a choiceful event, that it isn't something that just happens, and that the further out you look, the wider the array of choices that you can see, and that's the advantage, by the way, of doing long-term future views rather than short-term future views, because if you're looking 20 years from now or 50 years from now or even further, 100 years, you can see all kinds of choices that human beings are going to make between now and then that are going to determine, what happens. And so to describe a pattern as though it's inevitable when it comes to human beings and human societies seems like a fool's errand. It's kind of like saying we're at the end of history, in a sense that everything is done and nobody has any choices anymore, and it's just all going to be played out in this quite logical way. When in fact, tomorrow somebody's going to decide something that's going to surprise everybody, or discover something that surprises everybody that we never anticipated, and the world changes.
Well, in that case, the most famous example or counterexample of what you just say is, of course, Ray Kurzweil, who has a very specific timeline of how events would unfold. And he claims that if you look at computational power and even technological advancement overall, since, let's say, the US census of the 1890s onwards until today, we have this sort of exponential graph that's not being influenced by anything, not wars, not World War One, not recession, not World War Two, nothing really. And he's gone on the records to make these claims, very specific claims about certain kind of benchmarks, such as passing the Turing test, artificial general intelligence, etc. So how do we square these two, and whereabouts do you stand on
Well, yeah,
Ray's
that's an
claims?
intriguing one. I've shown his curves and his exponential curves in terms of growth of artificial intelligence, or we might even just say simply the number of transistors in a computer, um, and it does seem like those are very impervious to what's going on around them in human society. Those technological development curves, we can apply it now to solar energy, for example. Of course, there may be some upper bound at which you sort of reach a limit, but those curves do appear to be very steady. But they don't tell you that much about what human beings are going to do with these technologies or with these capabilities, or what these capabilities are going to do to humans. That's much more suppositional, and much more subject to nefarious actors doing bad things with them, and good actors doing good things with them, and naive actors doing things that maybe surprise everybody, and so on. So we don't to say, for example, that computers are going to be more intelligent, that is, have more transistors and connections than the human brain. I don't know what Kurzweil's most recent year for that was, but at one point it was 2028 or something like that, as I recall. That may be true, although I think it's actually slowing down a little bit. I think his curves have
Actually,
extended
if
just
I
a little.
remember correctly, the human brain claim was that by 2018, 2019, we would have the computational power of a human brain, which is 10 to the 16th, supposedly.
Hmm.
And then by 2028, he says the passing of the Turing test. And he has actually a famous bet with, what's the guy's name? Rich Kapoor or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
on long bets, which is for, I think, $20,000 or something, about going to charity, about whether, and they're very specific about what that
Yeah.
Turing test is supposed to be. However, let me just say that this is precisely why I love your work so much, because you nailed the heart of the matter, in my opinion, here. And I famously had a big sort of heated debate here on this podcast with Robin Hansom, who was kind of making the argument, well, it doesn't matter whether you're in Nazi Germany or in communist Eastern Europe or in the West. A car is a car, and the laws of physics are the laws of physics, and optimal design is optimal design. And my response to that kind of stems from your point of view, is like, yes, the laws of physics and all those things may be such, but how we use them, why we use them, towards what purposes, and what we use them to do to humans with them varies. So that's where it makes a difference. And to me, it doesn't matter how, what kind of technology we have, but what we use it for and what we use it towards, which always makes the difference. And surely, if you're a gypsy, a Jew, a homosexual, a disabled person, it would matter whether you're living in Nazi Germany or in the West. Clearly, all those things matter for millions and millions of people. So I don't care about the technology. I care about the impact of the technology of the people. And you nailed that straight on.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's, I've worked with, there's an interesting story to tell about that. I think, my emphasis has been partly because of who I learned a way of thinking about the future from, and we can tell some stories about that if you want. But
Sure.
that the emphasis has always been that the ultimate question is what is a preferred future? What is our preferred future? What is your preferred future? And the bias that I have, that if you change that image of the future, then you see other things to do today. So the future, and you're familiar with me saying this, the future creates the present. That if you change what you expect is going to happen in the future by coming up with a better forecast, or if you change what you think is possible in the future by brainstorming some ideas, or if you come to a conclusion that this is our vision, this is our dream, this is what we really want to accomplish, any one of those images or all of those images put together cause you, even unconsciously, to do different things in the present. So that the most powerful way to change what's happening today is to change people's image of the future.
Yeah, I want you to extrapolate on that a little bit because I think it's a key point, and I think the vast majority of us get it upside down. We always say that the present is a product of the past, and that we are where we are because of the past. But you say the exact opposite thing. You say the present is a result of the future, and so if you want to change the present, you have to change the future, which is totally counterintuitive, and I love it. I even read a fantastic article that I'm going to link to on your blog on that topic, but unpack that a little bit for us,
Yeah,
and then please connect it to the three types of future that you're talking about: preferred, possible, and probable.
yeah. I'll do that. The the concept does not deny that decisions were made in the past that gave us the world that we have today. We decided, for example, to organize our cities around automobiles. And so we have these massive streets and so on in American cities and many cities around the world that are organized around automobiles. And people did that in the past, and that's what we got. Now, if you want to change that, and many people would like to, you've got to enable people to see a different vision. And maybe that's a visual picture, or maybe it's a description, or maybe it's just a conversation that they have. In a certain sense, at a simple psychological level, it's the self-fulfilling prophecy. And I often have cited. I remember this really came home to me once watching the Olympics, and I was watching a diver, and they were standing. It was a high dive contest. They were standing at the bottom before they climb up to the top of the platform for their dive. And as the athlete stood there, the athlete had their eyes closed and were just doing all these little subtle movements. And having been an athlete myself, and remembering how often we rehearse things in our minds, I thought it's a perfect image of mental rehearsal, creating an image of the future, the successful dive, so that it has even both a conscious and even an unconscious impact over what you're doing when he actually is on the top, this particular diver on the top of the platform, and then making the dive. So self-fulfilling prophecy, or creating the dream or the vision, is very powerful, particularly if it's one that taps into your emotions or is actually important to you. I mean, organizations have visions and people read them and they don't really care whether they happen. But if your organization or you have a vision that you care about and you look at it and you say, that would actually make a difference, that would be important if we accomplish that, then you have this emotional attachment to it and you look down and you say, gosh, I should do this instead of that if I'm actually going to accomplish that vision. And so changing the image of the future is, in my opinion, the most potent leverage point for change in an organization or in an enterprise, perhaps even in an individual's life. And of course, there are all these various tools and so on for doing it.
Yeah, if you lose
Um,
all hope, people commit suicide, right? You end
yeah,
up being depressed, and eventually you get to the point where you see no reason to continue, because the image of the future to you is much worse off than your present, or at least as better as the
yeah,
present, and you
yeah.
see no improvement. And that surely has a direct impact there. And the athletes, perfect example of visualization.
Well, you remind me of the stories told by, I believe his name is Viktor Frankl, a survivor of the Holocaust and the camps. Um, and he was a pianist, a musician. And if I have the story exactly right, and when he was in the camp, he said the thing that kept him alive in comparison to many other people is that he constantly imagined himself playing a concert in a magnificent concert hall. He created this image of the future that kept pulling him forward and pulling him forward. And he said, "Well, so many of my compatriots just lost all hope. They could not see themselves in any kind of hopeful or positive or even living way in the future. And when they lost that hope, their ability to survive declined." And that was his story. And based on that, I remember reading a study of success in school, um, and what factors were correlated. That is it your family income? Is it whether you had good childhood education? And so on. And of course, all those factors have impacts on whether you're successful in school. But one of the factors that surprised the researchers in the particular piece of research that I read was the question was, does the child have a positive image of themselves in the future? Can they see themselves being successful? And thus, the researchers said one of the most important questions you can ask a child is, what do you want to be when you grow up? And if their answer is, I'll probably be dead, I'll be shot on the street, versus I want to be a firefighter, or I want to be president of the United States, or I want to be a concert pianist, those people have a much greater success record in school because they have something that kind of pulls them forward. Well, that's all simple psychological stuff at the individual level. What I've tried to do, and those who in the futures field who have that really were teachers of me, who worked with large organizations, large systems, state systems, and so on, um, to try to take that basic psychological concept and raise it to the complex level of societies or organizations, and say if you can create a positive image of yourself in the future, of your organization in the future, in a way that you embrace, then you'll be more likely to move toward it. Um, so that's been the philosophy that has underlaid most of my work.
Yeah, I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. As far as I know, the story is he was a psychiatrist who lost his family, and the story behind him staying alive was actually him being able to observe humankind in a sort of a psychological experiment that was never been able to be observed before. And his manuscript of the book was destroyed, and so his meaning to survive was so that he can rewrite that book with the updates from his psychological observations. And of course, that was the foundation of what's later known as logotherapy, which has a lot of Stoic philosophy imports in it. Also, a lot of sort of the narrative and the storytelling, in a way, somewhat Joseph Campbellian, if you will, in some ways, about the importance we attach to stories, that we attach to real events, and how the same event can have opposite interpretations based not on the actual event but on the story that we import on top of that event, which originates in us, not in the event itself. But let's go back to the distinction,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yeah.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, no. Then perhaps then I heard the story about Franco, and as he was using an example of what that kind of image would be, because if you're probably more than familiar with his actual work, but the principle still holds.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there were many musicians around him, and I would not be surprised if he was a musician in his spare time too, just like Einstein was. So I simply don't know that part of his biography. But let's talk about the distinction between the preferred, the possible, and the probable future.
Yes, and that's a very standard trope within the futures field, and people have expanded that a little bit to include plausible futures out of scenario work and so on. But that's the way I was really introduced to that, was through the person who was my mentor, Futurist, who had come out of the space program and then become a college president. And he used to really talk about these three questions: what is probable, what's possible, and what's preferred. And that really formed the original framework for my own thinking about the future. It formed the original framework for all those future cone models that everybody are relatively familiar with, where you have those three cones out in the future. And the difference is very simple. The probable future is the realm of forecasters, the realm of predictive models, and so on. And you're really trying to ask, what is likely to happen in the future, particularly what is most likely to happen in the future, or certainly what has a better than 50% chance of occurring. And there is value in trying to see that. There's a limit in trying to see it because the future is, in some senses, inherently unpredictable. Despite what we've said about these the models earlier in our conversation, but because there are always surprises. Um, but there is, a whole school of in the futures field of, even though the futures field likes to say we don't make predictions, in fact, there's a whole lot of effort that goes into making forecasts and enabling people to see with some level of accuracy what is likely to be true, more likely to be true than not be true in 5 or 10 or 15 or 50 years. So that's the probable future. And I think it's worth exploring. I'll tell an Alvin Toffler story about that in a moment. The second is the possible future. And I think there are two aspects of that. Number one is, what are the things that might happen in the future, or they might not, but if they do, they'll make a really big difference. Um, for example, I remember working once with young school children, and we were brainstorming things that might be possible in the future. And one of the junior high age kids said, humans will be able to breathe underwater. And I thought, well, of course, that's we consider that to be impossible, and it probably is impossible. But who knows? Who knows? Maybe there'll be some evolutionary change or some genetic engineering change that would make that possible. And if human beings could suddenly live and breathe underwater, well, it changes the game. So that's a thing that's unlikely to happen. But if it did, it would make a very big difference. That's one aspect of the possible future, the kind of the impossible things that might become possible. The other aspect is from an enterprise organizational perspective, if that's what you're doing is advising an organization, is an organization can ask, what is impossible for us right now, but if we made it possible would change our business model or change some aspect of our organization and so on. So those two parts of the coin. My mentor, whose name was Dr. Ed Lindemann, he used to say everything that's possible today was at one time in the history of the universe impossible. That's the evolution of species, the ability to see, the ability to build technology, and so on. If you go back to the Big Bang, everything was impossible. Well, in some sense, it was possible because it happened. But he would say it this way: everything that today is impossible may, at some point in the future, be possible, and that changes everything. So that's the possibility question, and I think that's a really valuable one to explore because it really challenges your creativity and your imagination.
Yeah, and that reminds me very much to Arthur Clarke's, uh,
Yes.
what is it, the three laws of Arthur C. Clarke. But let me ask you, because, yeah, go ahead.
Well, then we'll talk about the preferred. But yes, mentioning Arthur C.
Sure.
Clarke is the question of what is possible in the future is really, in some senses, the realm of science fiction writers.
Yeah.
They look at probable trajectories of both technology and societal events, and then they say, well, what if the world developed in this way? What if this was possible? Or what if faster or near faster than light speed travel was possible? What might society look like? So they play with that question, in my opinion, better than anybody else.
But they also play with what Greg Bear called the sugar-coated pill on my show, which is precisely the third option, which I almost didn't let you talk about, which is the preferred future.
The sugar, I haven't heard, now I know Greg. I never heard him use the term the sugar-coated pill, so that's fascinating. Yes, the preferred question is also an obvious question. All three of these are obvious questions about the future. But my approach has been that you ask the first two, what is probable and what is possible, so that you can answer more effectively the third question, what is preferred? What is my preferred future? If you sit down with a group of people, if you sit down, let's say you sit down with a leadership team in an organization, and you ask them, what's your vision of the future? They can probably tell you something. But if you say, before you answer that question, let's spend 24 hours, let's spend 3 8-hour days exploring what is probable in the future and what is possible, what might be possible in the future. And now let's answer the question again, what is our preferred vision? They will find some differences. They will see some things that are different because their minds have been stretched. Ultimately, we're all trying to always answer what is my preferred future? What do I want my life to be like tomorrow, next week, next year, and so on, even if we're not very consciously doing that. Um, I think it's the most powerful question. My One of my observations, again, I may not be quite fair on this, but I think the futures field, when I started in this in around 1980, while I was still a college professor, um, everybody I knew that I met kind of in the futures field, whether it was Dr. Ed Lindemann or Barbara Marx Hubbard or Robert Theobald or some of these old names, um, they were mostly interested in helping collections of people, however they were organized, define their preferred future, create a better world, rather than as compared to helping them make better forecasts of the world or create multiple scenarios so that they understood, were able to adjust what was happening when it was happening. Those are all useful activities and useful skills to have. But their belief, which really was inculcated in me, was the most potent thing that you can do is help people define a preferred future, and then devise steps and strategies and so on that might aim them toward it. And so that's what I've come out of. And so my bias has always been the first two questions are interesting and valuable and useful, probable, possible, but the most powerful question and the one we should work ultimately to try to answer is what is our preferred future?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, that's kind of the whole reason. Only I arrived to this conclusion from a very different way. That's to say, by import of ethics, because preferred is all about ethics, whether personal or corporate or civilization-wide, national, you name it, collective. But it's always about ethics, and so I came into that kind of conclusion from the ethical point of view. Uh, and to be honest with you, one of the trends that I see and that really dislike is that I think that's kind of being lost in the last, maybe I've been in the field for since, let's say, early 2000s, 2004, 5, since I started academically first taking interest and then later on professionally. But I think now people are getting to be precisely in what you were describing as more narrowly and narrowly specialized. In other words, they're starting to look at the world and history with straws, so they're limiting their field of view. Their aperture is shrinking, in other words. And to me, it's gotten to the point where it's all about predictions. Whereas, from my point of view, if I were to paraphrase Karl Marx and bring him into the sort of a futurist context, I would say something to the degree of futurists have always tried to predict the future, but the point, however, is to change it.
Well, that's my bias. Yes. Yes. Now, I'll add a caveat to that, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I did a project in 2000. I got invited by, there was a short-lived foundation in the Seattle area called the Future Foundation, and it was funded by a bunch of money from an aerospace executive who had a kind of a subcontracting aerospace company, but had been very successful. And he was a Swiss immigrant to the United States who had I don't know that it would be fair to say that he fled, during the war or before the war. I don't quite know the exact story, but he was he was very interested in the future. He asked me what he wanted to do was to bring together scientists, philosophers, high level scientists and philosophers, Nobel Prize winners, some of them, to ask them what will it take for humanity to survive for another 1,000 years. And so I sat with him, and I got to facilitate those sessions, and we call it Humanity 3000. And I said, well, the ultimate question we should ask them is what is their preferred future? And he went like this: no, absolutely not. Do not ask them that, he said, because Adolf Hitler had a preferred future. He said that's the most dangerous question in the world:
Wow.
is what is your preferred future? because he said Adolf Hitler and every dictator in the history of the world has had a preferred future. They had a very clear preferred vision, and they would do anything that was possible to do in order to create that, make that vision come true.
So
And
did the Dalai
it's,
Lama and Mahatma
I know.
Gandhi,
So yeah,
Martin Luther King
yes.
Jr., all of them had
So
preferred futures.
preferred futures are moral questions, as you pointed out, and they're debatable. He was a scientist engineer. His belief was that if these scientists and philosophers explored hard enough and effectively enough, it would become very obvious that there would be an obvious scientific answer to what human beings should do to survive for another 1,000 years. Now, the conclusion that that group came to, and we did several multi-day retreats with groups of them, was that it came down to choices that we were going to make, and it came down to whether we would choose to deal with the climate crisis, and whether or not we could overcome religious and other sources of conflict that lead to destructive behavior and so on. So and ultimately their conclusion, their scientific conclusion, was that it all came down to whether or not human beings could make good moral choices.
And that to me as a philosopher is kind of obvious. I mean, I'm happy that they got to that conclusion, but to me, what your funder there, the Swiss
Yeah, yeah,
aerospace engineer was exhibiting was a what I call the scientism or a technosolutionist bias,
yes.
which presumes that science can only take us forward and to a better situation and better outcome. And if we only just, focus on STEM, it would all be okay. And
That was
one of the offshoots, the dangerous offshoots of that kind of thinking is that you underfund the humanities, philosophy, art, and all of that, which are to me so science helps us live a better life, an easier life, more comfortable life, but it's the humanities and the arts that give us a reason to live, that tell us why we should be living in the first place, that tell us what we should be striving for in life in the first place, right? So science is merely a tool in the sort of the hands of the humanities, and you can incorporate it to destructive end. I mean, Nazi Germany was very scientifically advanced, He had the best scientists in the 30s around the world, basically were there. Berlin was the scientific center of the world.
mhm.
And Albert Einstein himself was very disappointed from his colleagues turning overnight German nationalists and switching their work from science into like weapons of mass destruction, mustard gas and whatnot,
Mhm,
you know.
mhm.
So to me that's obvious, but I'm happy that they got to that conclusion.
Yeah, it was really interesting that's where they ended up. There wasn't a simple scientific solution to surviving for another 1,000 years. It was all a matter of again the future being choiceful, something that we have to envision and choose over and over and over again.
And that makes me be optimistic that if we engage people like that, I mean, most of my audience is IT professionals and engineers, software engineers especially, and stuff like that. So, of course, they're people just like you and me, with their flaws, just like we have our flaws, and with their advantages over us. Like I'm not obviously as scientifically literate as them, never will be, because I'm not expert in that field. But we can all make progress. I can be better educated scientifically, and they can be better educated in terms of ethics. And then I think both the tool and the means in the end can come out to a better outcome, which has been sort of like the crux of my work for the last 11 years, trying to push this message against that tide of sort of narrowization and focus, tight focus of the futurist community.
Yeah, you're making me think of, we mentioned 1980 or so is when I really started this. I was just finishing a first stint as a college professor in the field of communication, and had come to the University of Washington here in Seattle, where I am now, and been here ever since, um, and to work on a PhD in the field of communication. But my futurist mentor, the old space guy, said, "Well, when you get to the University of Washington, go meet a guy named Ed Wenck." And Ed Wenck was the first science advisor to the Congress. But he worked but now he was a teacher in the School of Engineering at the University of Washington, where he was one of three professors in a very incredible program that they had at that time. It was called the Social Management of Technology. And it was one kind of Marxist professor and Ed Wank, this former science advisor. And
Wow.
their question was, technology always has unintended consequences. How can we socially anticipate and socially manage those consequences in a more effective way and ahead of time and to the best of our ability and so on. So that actually became sort of my minor. I still studied communications. I studied how computer networks would change human communication. But as part of that, I took courses in the social management of technology, and it was very powerful. It's exactly what we're talking about trying to get this the mix of, let's call it, humanities and science engineering right, so that people approach the world with sort of a dual skill set instead of one or the other. One of my concerns about the crisis in higher education right now, and that by that I mean the financial crisis that higher education faces, is in the world that we're in now, highly technological, highly oriented around work and jobs, and so on. Uh, that we will lose as we will lose humanities, philosophy, and so on. This has been a constant concern for those who are interested in higher education for a long time. Is that when the funding crisis hits, we ask, well, which of our courses help people get jobs? Let's keep those. And which ones don't help people get jobs? Well, that's philosophy and humanities, so forget that. And I'm afraid we might unbalance that in some ways that we shouldn't. It would be much better if we actually um, let sort of just-in-time education and so on deal with a lot of the technological education, in my opinion, and poured a little bit more effort into humanities, philosophy, and so on, given the the sort of technological versus humanity, technology mixed with humanity, who's in charge, what's going to happen, all of those kinds of questions that are going to be so important in a Kurzweilian world in the next 20 years.
Right, we're going to come back to that. But before that, perhaps I want to share a little story with you because it's like right on this topic. When I was
Mm-hmm.
undergraduate at the University of Toronto, there was this debate, if I remember, between the Department of Philosophy and the Department of, or one of the, maybe it was the Rotman School of Business even. And the question was, who makes more money, philosophers or business graduates? And it's a statistical,
Yeah,
empirical question, 100%. You
sure.
know, you look at the graduates for the last several decades, you aggregate the numbers, and you see the result. And guess what? Philosophers after graduation start at much lower pay job. They earn 30, in some cases 50% less right out of school as compared to people right out of business school. However, look at them over the entirety of their career, and especially towards the end of their career, they're making often twice more in the long run
Fascinating. Yeah.
than business school graduates. And the best part was that the top level executives. So if you wanna be a mid-level executive, the conclusion was and make, let's say, $150,000 a year, you should go do an MBA or something like that. If you want to be a high-end executive like a CEO or high-end VP, make a lot more money than that and have a lot more impact, you should study philosophy.
Yeah, well, there's really no surprise in that, is there? I mean, it makes perfect sense. And in fact, if you listen to high level executives at tech companies and so on, and you ask them, who are the best people that you want to hire, they will all, historically they'll say, well, I'd rather hire a liberal arts graduate and train them how to code than hire a coder who doesn't know anything about anything else in the world. Now, they don't necessarily always follow that advice that they claim that they believe, but that's not surprising. But I do think that the first in higher education, the first impulse when there's a financial crisis is to look for departments that are not necessarily seen as job training. That's the way it works.
Yeah, and the caveat of my story is that I'm not sure if that argument holds in general or just in particular with the University of Toronto graduates specifically.
Mm-hmm.
That's where
Oh yeah,
I can't claim it to be a general sort of fact. But what you said there also reminds me to many of the technological predicaments that we're facing today, which I would claim stem directly from nerdy coders who ended up at very high places without the faintest clue about ethics and sort of humanities and history. And a good example of that is Mark Zuckerberg, in my opinion.
Hmm.
I, for
Hmm.
example, was utterly shocked when I watched him in a conversation with Yuval Noah Harari. I was utterly shocked about how narrow minded, defensive, poorly educated about historical context, trends, and things like that Mark actually is. And now people say he was a brilliant coder and all around nerd and geek, and that may be true. But actually, I think, and we see the results have been very detrimental in so many ways because of that.
Yeah.
And you can say the same
Yeah.
about Instagram founders, maybe even Larry and Sergey even.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know about them as much, but I think you're right. And I've been around some, not a lot, but some uh, very successful technology company leaders, and it's probably true in other fields as well. But it certainly is true there that it's very easy for people who achieve that pinnacle of success, particularly if it comes fairly fast and fairly young, to convince themselves that they must be really smart about everything. I'm not
Exactly.
saying anything that people haven't said before or haven't thought about before. Uh, and so I've seen many of them significantly, in my opinion, of course, who am I to say, overestimate their knowledge of or their deep understanding of a field that they really know very little about, simply because they are very smart people, but their focus has been relatively narrow.
Yeah, and after interviewing 260 people on the record for my podcast and having probably double or triple off the record conversations with
Hmm.
those people and people like that, my impression is that genius and stupidity are roommates under the same roof. And that's part of the
Fascinating.
human condition. But many of those people, because of the accolades and the enormous authority and prestige that carry with them, simply take it for granted that, oh, I know about string field theory and therefore I can talk about sociology or politics or ethics or you name it.
Yeah, yeah, and not only that I could take over that field and run it if I wanted to. It's one thing to talk about it. We
Right,
we go, we all talk about things
right,
to the best of our understanding,
right,
but to believe that the skill set that they have qualifies them to go run this or do that. It comes out most often in saying that the government or schools should be run like a business, in my
right,
opinion,
right,
when they're vastly different kinds of enterprises.
right.
So anyway,
Let me switch the conversation here because we digressed a little bit and ask you this. You've had a very long overview of the field of futurism. So let me see how I can put this in the best way possible. First, what are the big problems or issues that humanity as a civilization from the big macro picture is facing today? And secondly, how does that compare to the same big issues and problems that you saw 40 years ago in the 1980s? In other words,
yeah,
have those
yeah.
changed? Have they evolved in any way? What's different? What's similar?
I would say the number one issue that we face right now is the issue of collective decision making. And that's a little bit different than it was in the 1980s, in that we knew that we had conflict in the world between different systems of government and so on. But even then there was more of an impetus toward, for example, global cooperation or approaching global problems and doing the best we can as a global community. Right now, here in the year 2020, we have divided up more so. And I think there's a real impetus in the world back toward nationalism, back toward being suspicious of people who are not from your area, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's the number one problem. How can we make collective decisions on a global scale and avoid falling into nationalistic and xenophobic traps. And there's it's been revealed here in the United States and I think in several other countries around the world in the last 10 years or so, but particularly in the last half dozen years and in the Trump years here, that there's a surprisingly large percentage of people who would be quite comfortable living in a nationalistic, even fascist, and quite xenophobic kind of governance system. And that's not going to work for the other big problems that we have. Number one of which is the whole climate challenge, which is a global challenge. Now, we were talking about that in the 1980s. We talked about it as environmental issues. I was a college kid when the first Earth Day began, and so we've been concerned about and aware of concern about the environment for a very long time. But in 1980, when I was giving my very first talks as a futurist, I would talk about desertification, and I would talk about the Oglala aquifer and loss of water, and I would talk about air pollution and water pollution and so on. But we didn't talk about global warming because it just wasn't on the radar. There were some scientists who were paying attention to it, but those of us in the general community were not. And now when we talk about environment, we mostly talk about climate change. And I think that's clearly the biggest challenge that we have. And it takes a global approach to deal with it. It takes national commitment, it takes local commitment, but it also takes this global approach, which we are not yet capable of really engaging. The After global warming, after sort of getting global governance or in cooperation to an effective level, and then after climate change, I would say that the next issue is it's sort of economic, but it is the divide between the wealth and poverty, the income divide, the wealth divide, and so on. Now, there are two sides of that coin. Number one, we have been lifting more and more people in the world out of poverty, and an increasing percentage of the world population is defined as having a middle income or a middle class kind of lifestyle. That's quite a low number in terms of the amount of dollars that you have in many parts of the world. But we have been doing a somewhat effective job of that. But at the same time, we've been drifting toward, drift is not the right word, maybe it's racing toward a smaller and smaller percentage of the global population owning and controlling a higher and higher percentage of global wealth. And in that sense, my science fiction writer friend David Brin captures it best when he says that human societies through almost all of human history, as we understand it, were organized in a pyramid, where a very few people at the top. We've called them royals, we called them kings, we called them queens, we call them autocrats, we call them all these different terms. They owned all
Techpreneurs.
the wealth. Yeah, they owned all the wealth, and they controlled the work of everybody else. Everybody, in a sense, worked for them, and you paid them taxes and so on. And he said, the American Revolution and the French Revolution and the democracy revolution of the last couple of hundred years was an effort to overturn that pyramid. Doesn't limit people necessarily from being wealthy, but it wasn't to have this pyramid with a few wealthy people controlling everything. And the last, since 1970, 1980 especially, the world has been moving in that direction again. And Brin will argue, I think he does, that this is actually a very deliberate effort. It's not like an accidental thing that's happening. It's that people believe this is the way we should organize society. I should be in charge. I should own all the wealth. I'm the smartest person, etc. And that dealing with that is part and parcel of those first two things I mentioned, particularly the first one, global government. So those are the three biggest issues I think that we face. Now you can get into management of technology and what do we do with AI, and you can talk about gender equity, which is a significant issue. Both in terms of pay and in terms of position in organizations. Those are all issues that were there, at least the fledgling versions of them in the 1980s. But those first three that I mentioned, I think are the big ones that to me are the answer to whether we get through. I'm going to talk about space here. I've always been really interested in the Fermi paradox and why we aren't visited by other civilizations all the time. Though I did in my life once see a UFO, so that's a whole nother story. But
Wow, you're blowing my mind here right now.
yeah, yeah. So why aren't we seeing all these people? And and one of the theories is that the reason we don't see a lot of civilizations in this massive universe in which we live that have figured out how to overcome the physics of these great distances is that every civilization goes through a great filter, that they achieve a level, and
Right.
you're familiar with this, of course, they achieve a level of technological development without achieving a commensurate level of political development, so that that technology is more likely to destroy them than to enable them to move into the stars. And you've got to go through this filtering process where you have the technological capability, but you also have the philosophical and political capability to make it. And we're in, my opinion, one can argue, I think, quite persuasively, that the 21st century that we're in now is the century of our great filter. We're either going to solve the climate issue or deal with it effectively by the end of the century, or we're never going to expand into the universe. We're going to solve this global cooperation problem, or we're not going to expand into the universe. And we're going to solve this financial equity problem, or we're not going to expand in the universe. If we solve all three of those things, then a whole I was going to say a whole world opens up, a whole universe opens up. Certainly a whole solar system opens up. So we're in that the crux of that, and that's more clear now than it was, of course, in 1980. Um, the
Let me ask you here, though, uh, just just so to kind of look at where futurists were back then and today, right? And by the way, just one example is when you were talking about certain people who thought that, as a good example of the kind of person who would think that, oh, this is how it should be, and the pyramid structure is a good structure, and we should just sustain that. Peter Thiel is a good example of that, right? He basically says that personal liberty with respect to gathering infinite amounts of capital and possessions and stuff like that is irreconcilable with democracy. And so, since we're forced to choose between democracy and sort of like infinite growth of capital, he's on the side of capital. And I'm severely paraphrasing him here, but that's kind of like the bottom line of his argument, and which is why he's not known for a big supporter of democracy. But let me bring that loop back to the futurists and the big themes of the 80s and the big theme of today, because you identified as today's biggest issue the sort of rise of nationalism, polarization, whether ideological or economic, etc. So my question then is, did the futurists of the 1980s foresee that and anticipate that? And if they did or they didn't, why, and what are some examples of that? Because to my knowledge, take for example Donald Trump. In 2015, very few people, futurists or otherwise experts, would have even seen him as sort of the Republican candidate to begin with, let alone even winning the election. And of course, most people were betting multiple times against him over in favor of Hillary, even after he was the GOP candidate. So it's fair to say that they missed it at that level, but what about sort of the long view perspective and then that whole phenomenon that unleashed where we are today and you identified as a big
yeah
issue?
yeah yeah there's that's a very complex web to untangle. But let me just pick out a couple of pieces that come to mind. um, One is, I think that futurists um, got it wrong at that time to some degree, because the drift in the world, we'd come out, you know, I- you go back to 1940s, UN, an effort at global cooperation. Nobody ever really thought the UN was that effective, but even in the 1980s, people were still pretty committed to it. There was some ferment on the American right about why we should be out of it, and so on. Um, the level of religious conflict, particularly conflict between Islam and the rest of the world, was not as significantly was not as significant on the world stage as it became just a decade and a half later. And in fact, wasn't that long before that there was a whole ecumenical movement in the world, which was kind of the strongest movement in global religion at the time, which was that we should all kind of come together and see things in a cooperative kind of way, and that all drifted away. But I think that I don't know that this is really fair to say, but that most futurists at that time kind of believed that we would continue, as Fukuyama eventually said, toward this more utopian end of history kind of idea. Now, there were undoubtedly some who were warning about potential problems around nationalism. There were some, certainly, there was great concern around environmental issues in the futurist community in the 1980s.
I think
I
that's one
remember,
positive example of something
yeah,
we got right, more or
yeah,
less.
that's something that we really did get right. But I don't think that people anticipated that we would kind of revert to a more nationalistic, um, yeah, a more nationalistic world. In fact, I remembering now in the 80s and 90s, there was lots of conversation about the end of the nation state. That we were on a trajectory where the nation state would fade away, and we may maintain sort of the fiction of nations for reasons of national pride and to have World Cup teams and so on. But as a governing structure, that was sort of would disappear into the background, and we would achieve some new level of organization. It might be a combination of hyper organized local level and global level, but the nation state would fade away. That was almost an article of faith among many people in the futurist community, I would say, and others in the political science community and elsewhere in the
Totally,
1980s.
totally. I even remember the so-called McDonald's theory, the McDonald's theory of
Yes,
peace,
yes,
where, as you know, two countries that both had McDonald's at the same time never actually went to war with each other. And that kind of goes towards that end of
yes,
history kind of
yeah,
ideological view that
yeah,
as long as you have the sort of commercial or capitalist system in the background, it would create other sort of mechanisms or tools of conflict resolution. And,
yeah, yeah.
two countries that both had McDonald's at the same time never went to war.
That was true until the Balkans War. It was the Balkans War that blew that theory up, so to speak. Um, yeah, one of the, it's fascinating. Some historians, in a few decades from now, maybe longer than that, will look back probably at the 1990s. At the approach to the millennium. The Soviet Union had fallen, the Berlin Wall had come down. There really was a peace dividend. Um, the American economy was growing. There were democratic movements in former Eastern Europe. The American budget was such that the federal budget was going into surplus to the degree to which the chair of the Federal Reserve became concerned that we would pay off all of our debt, and he couldn't figure out how the economic system would work if the U.S. government didn't have any debt. Um, and and that was the world as the millennium turned, and then it all blew up. And why? Historians will ask, why did they not embrace that and keep moving in that direction?
Yeah, and that's my concern. You see, that's why I'm bringing this here, because my concern is that we as the experts, a community of experts, because the
Hmm.
futurist sort of community was organized sort of like, to my understanding, after World War II, in the context of sort of the Cold War and especially nuclear weapons and so on, to
Yes.
sort of game theoretical analysis and sort of foreseeing the different possible and plausible and preferable future scenarios in a sort of a game theoretical relationship with the Soviet Union and later on China and other nuclear armed powers. Now, our community missed the collapse of the Soviet Union, let alone a peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, even more so, right? So then we kind of missed this kind of nationalism and polarization that you're talking about now, which is kind of a return to the 1920s and 1930s in a way, right?
Yes.
Sort of pre-Weimar or Weimar Germany, even, if you will. And we see that all over the world, in Brazil, in the Philippines, Poland, Hungary, all over Europe, in the East, in the West. It's all over the place. It's hard to escape. So we missed that too. So when we say, and I agree with you, by the way, that probably the 21st century may be that great filter, whether humanity survives or doesn't survive. Yet at the same time, I'm very conscious that many people as smart or smarter than us, surely smarter than me and wiser than me, have made that sort of prediction since the beginning of the world, since the Romans and the Greeks. Every generation thought that, the world is going to the dogs, basically.
Yep.
So I'm very conscious of that. And especially given our history of missing the major events in the past, I'm kind of trying to second guess my own self.
Let me say two things about that. In 1982, I went to one of my very first World Future Society conferences, and that was at the time the organization for global futurists, amateur and professional. And interestingly enough, that it was organized very much like it attempted to emulate the UN. And the gatherings of the World Future Society were actually called General Assemblies. So it was sort of modeled on that UN model. And that's sort of an aside. I went to a session in which Alvin Toffler was the keynote speaker, and he said, "So the field of future studies has been around. This was 1982, and I think it really became a field in the late 1960s. I mean, there were Juvenal's, forget his name, the French futurist, and there was the Dutch futurist, Fred Pollack, and some others writing stuff well before that. But as a sort of recognized field, it sort of began in the late 1960s. So he said, we've been around for whatever that was, 15 years, 20 years. And he said, and the question is, why have we had no impact? And he said, my answer is, we've focused on the wrong question. He said, we have focused on what is probably going to happen in the future, and trying to help people make better forecasts. When he said we should be asking, what are the things that might not happen in the future, but if they do, they're going to change everything. And that's what we should be trying to discover and identify. And that's interesting. Your description of missing, for example, the fall of the Soviet Union. If we had asked that, people had been asking, well, what is something that might happen? The Berlin Wall might come down. Then what? Then we might have been more effective in that way. What's also true that you mentioned in the 1980s, everybody was worried about nuclear proliferation and nuclear winter and nuclear war and so on. And we hadn't really started the drawdown of nuclear weapons, and we didn't really have as effective a treaties as we've had in recent years around nuclear weapons. So that was when people talked about global threats in the 1980s. Nuclear war was still considered very high, if not the highest thing on the list, and that's certainly different now.
Is it? Is it really different now?
It's not high on people's list of concerns.
But should it not be?
But in a renationalizing world, where there actually is a proliferation of nuclear weapons to more nations, secretly or not so secretly, maybe we should return to that. I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, maybe we should. The futures community should put that back on the list of the 5 top global threats. That we might otherwise leave it off of.
To me, it's definitely like probably number 3 on the list or somewhere there. Because first, we have a growing list of countries such as North Korea and Iran joining the previously 7. And then, so it's now more like 9, really. And then on top of that, we have this kind of extreme polarization rhetoric of nationalism. We have a number of small-scale wars, most recently between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh area, currently as we now speak, which was kind of funded and organized by Turkey, which is a NATO member. Actually, some of the targeting systems on the drones that Turkey gave the Azerbaijanis were designed, the software was designed in Canada, which was a shock to many Canadians once we found out. But here you go, and of course that's because Turkey is a NATO ally, and so combine that with the fact that you have Putin in Russia, and you have China more and more reasserting itself. You have kind of a president of the United States which is very impulsive and doesn't really have a policy directive, but rather kind of improvises impromptu what to do and how to do it.
Yeah, we're in it. Yeah, and in terms of that, we might be in a very dangerous 2-month period vis-a-vis Iran in particular,
now,
because there is a scenario in which you can say one way to maintain power would be to start a significant conflict and then say declare a national emergency.
Exactly, that's what Margaret Thatcher
did.
Next
year I need to stay. Yeah, I need to stay in power at least for another year.
Margaret Thatcher used that too, by the way, when she was very low in the polls. She basically used the crisis of the Maldives and kind of declared all national mobilization and kind of a war and sort of shifted attention and then won the consequent election because of her successful conducting of that war against Argentina in this case. But many people, and Putin was very strengthened with the annexation of the Crimea, right? So we see that over and over and over again.
I think you're right. I think it should be put back on the list and put high on the list. And we'll see. Now there are these reports that Putin might retire in January for health reasons.
Right, Parkinson's supposedly. We'll see.
Yeah, Parkinson's, and we'll see whether that's really true. One doesn't know.
Yeah.
We'll see whether the transfer of power happens here and gets us perhaps into a slightly safer space. But all the other dynamics that you mentioned are still there, particularly the proliferation issue and this extreme nationalism. I do want to come back to the great filter idea. I do want to say one thing that countering what you said, which is when I say the 21st century might be the century of the great filter, I have no doubt that human beings will survive the 21st century and be around for centuries after that. The question is in what state? And when I say the great filter, I'm really referring only to our ability to become a multiplanetary civilization.
Right.
That if we don't get through this century in an effective way, it severely limits our ability to become multiplanetary. I'm not one who believes that as they might have during the Roman times or all these other times where we're nearly at the end of the world and humans are going to be wiped out. I don't believe that. I think it's more likely than not that human beings will be around 1 million years from now. But exactly in what state and exactly in what level of technological development, that's open to question.
Well, this is a perfect sort of segue from talking about the past to talking about the future and how it could sort of change our present, perhaps. So let's kind of take the tools that you were sharing with us in the beginning and see if we can sort of utilize them to first create a vision of the future, and second, see how it could influence our present. So walk us through this. What, in your view, now I'm just going to sort of ask you to sort of lecture us or show us how it's done. So what is the probable and possible future from where we are today? 2 months before a power change presidential election in the United States, environmental challenges, climate change challenges, nationalism, social media issues, global pandemic, let us not forget. So it's a very kind of complex and complicated situation. So what are the projecting forward and then backwards, the possible, probable, preferred?
Let me pick 3 or 4 of those areas, domains, let's call them, and apply those questions to them. Probable future is that we have a satisfactory transfer of power in the United States. That's probable. Uh, Still, it's possible that we don't, but it's probable that we do, and that puts us on a better trajectory vis-a-vis the pandemic, because it enables the United States to re-enter cooperation with the rest of the world in confronting the pandemic, as well as coming up with a more effective pandemic response in the United States, which is vital for the rest of the world. And that's the best thing that can come out of this transfer of power, is sort of putting us back in cooperating with the World Health Organization and developing a global strategy to take care of this particular pandemic and be better prepared for future potential pandemics. So that's probable. It's probable that we will not effectively deal with climate change in a way that keeps temperatures to non-emergency levels. So we won't keep it to 1.5 degrees. We won't keep it to 2 degrees. Perhaps we can keep it not, below too much above that. But given the trajectories that we're on in terms of emissions, given the trajectories that we're on in terms of global commitments and cooperation, even with the U.S. coming back into the Paris Accords, which is not necessarily it's more of a list of targets for people to try
It's
to reach.
aspirational.
It's aspirational. It's likely that climate change is going to become a severe problem in this century. And I don't know that it's fatal. I don't think it's fatal. And I think that over the next, it's probable that over the next 20 years, the world will perhaps even over the next 10 years, the world will step up and take much more aggressive actions to deal with it. But we're late. We're already very late on that. And it's probable that the income gap, the wealth gap, will continue to get worse, and that nationalism will continue to get worse in the near-term future. And by that I mean in the decade of the 2020s. But it's possible. Now let's go to the possible question on those. It's possible that um, this particular government transition wakes people up enough. It's kind of an outside possibility, but wakes people up enough in the U.S. and has a ripple effect on the world that we say, we really do need to step back and look at these significant problems, global warming and pandemics, and if we want to add in nuclear proliferation and income inequality, and do something more aggressive about them. That's a possibility. And there are many, many pathways that would take you to effective actions on that. So, what would be good in the next few years would be to have some descriptions made. I'd like to see be post-apocalyptic films are always popular, and I don't know that you can make a popular television series or a popular film out of something that's post-utopian.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be interesting to try to say what would the world look like if we tackled these kinds of issues in an effective and in particular a global systemic way. So that's the possible side. What we really need at this time is a global vision. I tell the story some. It's actually the lead tweet on my my whatever they call that tweet that you have at the top of your Twitter feed, and I wrote about this at futurist.com in the last year. 1984, Barbara Marx Hubbard, one of the great futurists in my opinion, and very much a visionary futurist. She was all about global vision, global evolution, and the fact that it was not only desirable, but in her opinion, kind of inevitable that we would eventually spiral up to a higher level of consciousness and a higher level of development. Well, anyway, in 1984, she, long story about it, but she ran for vice president on the Democratic ticket. That is to say, she ran in the primaries, running for vice president, which is not something that you do in the primaries, but it turned out that it was legally possible to do that. And I got involved in that campaign and was the chair of here in the state of Washington for a while, and so helped work on that campaign. And eventually, she got nominated at the Democratic Convention in 1984. But the platform she ran on was to turn the office of the vice president in the United States into an office for the future, to create an office for the future, Kim Stanley Robinson, who you've probably interviewed as well. His most
Not
recent
yet,
book
unfortunately.
is oh, you haven't? Oh, you've got to get him. I might be able to help you with that, but um, yeah, seriously, I probably can. But his most recent book is Ministry for the Future, which is a new UN type sub agency designed to help uh, helps humanity better prepare for the future. Well, Barbara's platform was to create an office for the future within and run by the office of the vice president. And it's a fantastic vision. It should be done. And her concept was the president is in charge of the war room. When something bad happens in the world, the president and his people or her people, they go into the war room and they have all the information flowing in from all over the world, from the intelligence agencies and elsewhere, and they decide how to deal with this conflict or this war-like problem. And she said there should be a commensurate office called the Office for the Future, the peace, and the peace room that the vice president in charge. And that room would have intelligence that is collecting all of the breakthroughs that are happening all around the world. The technology breakthroughs, the social breakthroughs, the breakthroughs in how you deal with homeless people, whatever it might be. And that office is constantly collecting all that information. And the vice president is in charge of collating all that information and developing new solutions to world problems. It's very, very, very utopian kind of thinking. One might think it's a little bit anachronistic to think in that way, but that's really what would be a good thing. So that's the preferred future. We ought to have a more effective way of creating images of or visions for the preferred future, whether it's around climate or whether it's around weapons or whether it's around how you deal with income inequality. Here in the States, that would mean, for example, how you actually do solve the problem of homelessness, which is a gigantic problem in this country right now. So my vision would be partly to create that kind of an effort, and then through that effort to create actual visions, and then having identified, for example, how you would deal with income inequality and homelessness, you start implementing solutions. Does that make sense? Does that put it together in the way that you were asking?
Totally, totally. And I even watched right before we sat down to do our interview Barbara's original speech
Oh, you
at that
did. Yeah.
Democratic
Yeah.
convention, which is brilliant. And I even tweeted all about it and shared it all over the
Yeah.
place
It's really
because I
brilliant.
love
It's
it.
only 10. It's only for those who hear this, it's only 10 minutes long, maybe 12 minutes long, but it's really worth listening to get a sense of what an inspiring vision could sound like, which because we don't hear them very often.
Okay, Glenn. So I want to bring in technology here. So I want to bring in the possible, probable, and preferred future with respect to technology in general, and perhaps things such as artificial intelligence in particular. But before that, let me just touch on one point of the possible future, because we here in Canada are, to be honest, quite concerned looking down at what's going on with you guys. What's the chance you think that the possible future would involve some kind of a civil war in the United States?
It is absolutely a possible future, and the reason is that the polarization has gotten very extreme, as to nobody's surprise, who follows the news, um, and the U.S., in contrast to most countries, is so heavily armed. The citizenry have, there's just so many arms that it would be really possible for a demonstration to turn into a battle, to spill over into a neighboring city, to spill over into a neighboring state, and so on. I still, you still want to think that's a fairly far-fetched scenario,
I hope so.
but I don't discount it. One can see in the level of vitriol that exists now how it happens. You get a sense for how even people in the same families can have such a high level of different of conflicting opinion about how the world is and how the world should be. And as we all know, anybody who's been paying attention, this is all extremely exacerbated by social media and what social media became. Like most people, I was quite the fan of social media. Believed that it had been a very positive force at the beginning of the Arab Spring and so on. But it wasn't the failure of that, and the ability to then to remanipulate social media to bring those movements to an end, and now the extremity to which social media bubbles us off, enables us to bubble ourselves off and to create these incredible echo chambers. I don't know. I don't know how to unwind that. I really don't. It's we're not going to get to that level of vision, let's say, of a global cooperation around climate change or whatever it might be, if we don't get a handle on that. And I don't have any idea how that's going to happen.
I think compassion, the only thing I can think of personally is the Dalai Lama way. Compassion and compassion to a different point of
Yeah.
view,
Yeah.
and recognizing their humanity. And that brings me to that sort of point where we are experiencing exactly what you're talking about within the same family. First, and so let me share with you a few stories here on this. So first, my wife's family on her mother's side is all from Rochester, New York, and the vast majority of her relatives voted for Donald Trump once and voted for him second time, including her mom. Needless to say, that didn't help very much during the Canadian Thanksgiving, which we have about a month
Yeah.
before you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have that in the family, straight in the family. Secondly, then you have people like, for example, I had another friend who's been on the podcast, and she was telling me she had the same sort of polarization in her own family, and she was telling her parents, "You guys are Jews. Which part of the sort of the wrong race do you not get? Do you not get you're the next ones?" And yet she couldn't even convince them of that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then finally, I got an email just like 3 days ago or something by someone who says they've been listening to my podcast for a long time, but they would not continue to do so because of my very strong liberal bias, and because of the fact that there's been this phenomenon where that person was worried about their job because of their political support for Donald Trump, and how the McCarthyism period now was being reversed, and this time the Democrats were going to be the oppressors, and people like him were scared for losing their job, and that's why he was forced to use a fake email address and all of that, and how I was part of the oppressors. Uh, because of my liberal bias,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I
and
like what you say.
so I was even thinking maybe I'll stop down and sort of like make a brief podcast episode on this, because it's an important issue, and it's an issue which would impact on our future probably if we don't bridge that polarization, and it's an issue of ethics, and but to me the only way I can think of confronting that issue is compassion, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and avoiding righteousness, avoiding superiority, whether of intellectual or moral kind, and being perfectly sort of like present and open and compassion, and then throw in the recipe that we're living in right now is ideal for actual civil war. I think you have a contested election, or at least close election, which has been contested by at least one of the sides. You have a very large number of people, 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump. They, like him, or many of them, may not recognize the outcome of the election. And you have a global pandemic, you have unemployment, you have all kinds of issues that can exasperate that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I just wanted to share that kind of with you at the
Yeah, I think
background.
I mean we have that in my own family too, man. I don't have living parents, but among siblings, we have one sibling who is very much a Trumper, and what we've done, and I think all sides of the political spectrum fall into this, and this is why your antidote is so important. The Dalai Lama compassion antidote would be so important, and I'm listening very carefully to what you say, um, because we are in this era in which, and Joe Biden said this in his acceptance or his victory speech, such as it's been. He said we've got to return, and was his language, to a world where we view each other as, I can't remember exactly how he said it
Not
was. It
blue
was
states and red states, but the United
not blue,
States.
not blue states, red states, but also not as that we view each other as ideological opponents or policy
But not
opponents, but
enemies.
not as enemies.
Yeah.
And that's the key phrase: to view each other not as enemies, and that applies globally.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
if we're gonna get through the great filter, which is, just it's a hard nut for human species to crack. We've got to, you know, have a vision of not viewing each other as enemies, even if we are quite different ideologically and in terms of our policy opinions on what should or shouldn't happen. Um, but that's that's very hard to do. And the ingredients you listed off as precursors or perhaps necessary but not sufficient for a civil war, I would tend to agree with,
I hope so. I
because
hope
we
not
have,
sufficient.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and speaking of enemies, by the way, a funny story from my undergraduate degree, totally irrelevant. Well, but at least funny, I think, and interesting because it kind of illuminates people's psychology. I was first year undergraduate student in political science, and my interest was always in just war theory and stuff like that. And I was attending this conference where there was a retired general from the U.S. Marine Corps, I think, if I remember, talking about the Cold War. And he was talking about the first days when he was, I think, maybe a lieutenant or something like this. And he referred in a particular meeting in a presence where there were very many four-star generals from the Navy with him. And he referred to the Soviet Union as the enemy. And one of the four-star generals corrected him by saying, the Soviet Union is the opponent, my friend. The enemy is the U.S. Air Force.
That's good.
So,
That's really good. Love it.
so that goes on to show
Yeah,
you sort of human nature and how, the
yeah,
Russians, they're all over there, they're the opponent, but actually the daily fights that we fight with, usually for money and
yeah,
influence and
yeah,
power and prestige, are right here on our
yeah,
shorts. And it's,
yeah,
is the Navy going to get this and we're going to build the next generation of aircraft carrier, or is the U.S. Air Force is going to get these missiles or these new stealth
yeah,
bombers or
yeah,
what have you? So
yeah,
anyway, that kind of hopefully lightens up the mood and enlightens us a little
yeah,
bit about
yeah,
the human
yeah.
psychology. But let's go back to topic here and talk about the technology here. Let's talk about how
Yes.
artificial intelligence will fit into that big complex picture. What would it change? What's the possible, what's the probable, and what's the preferable future of artificial intelligence here? And what's the timeline to those, if you can share with
Boy,
us? Do you
yeah,
go along
yes.
the Kurzweilian timeline or not?
Yeah, well, I no, I don't. I think he's too aggressive. I understand the mathematical calculation in terms of comparison to the brains, and those may not be, but whether that translates into human-like or beyond human-like intelligence, I think is still an open question. And we won't know the answer, I suppose, until we get there. I also read some from Rodney Brooks. I don't know if you've had Rodney on the show, and he's a bit more skeptical on how quickly we see general artificial intelligence. The probable is that the capacity of computing and the capacity of computing continues to develop on the curves that it tends to be on. That includes quantum computing, and that enables us to develop something that we label artificial intelligence at the rates somewhat like Kurzweil is talking about. Um, the 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 possibility is there are obviously two possibilities. One, um, the machines become extremely effective at their specialized task, but never really make that breakthrough into a generalized and intelligence that mimics or even could be described as conscious. I think that's one possibility, but the other possibility is that they do, and that they become equal to, then rivals of, and then superior to our own intelligence.
And what's the
And
timeline to that you foresee, perhaps?
well, I no, I don't. My own opinion is that we don't see that in this century. I
Oh,
don't. Yeah, but then I am not immersed in what's happening with current artificial intelligence, nor what's happening with other than at a pretty cursory level
mhm.
with quantum computing. So
Well, let's put that into the possible future day. Let's say that
yeah,
it's possible that we
I
are.
think it's possible that it comes sooner, and I think it's probable that it comes later.
Mhm.
But in any case, it comes. In any case, it eventually arrives. Though again, I think whether it really achieves the level of consciousness that Kurzweil originally wrote about when machines become conscious, I that will all depend on the definition of consciousness, I suppose. But I think that could be harder than we know, because there just may be more. There may be more, for lack of a better word, magic inside our neurons and the system that it supports than we're able to ever figure out. But it's possible, and so then the question becomes, I think, what is preferred? And my friend Gerd Leonard in Europe is the one who's writing about this, technology versus humanity, for example. And the preferable future is one clearly where artificially intelligent machines of various forms and shapes and purposes exist to supplement human intelligence and to offload things that we no longer need or want to do. Uh, but that has to be done in such a way, in a preferred future, that there's a reinvention and a rethinking at a very deep level of what is the purpose of being human. Um, what might we do if we don't need to do drudgery task number A or B? Um, Really, what is our fundamental purpose? Is it creating art? Is it um, helping people at an emotional level that even artificially intelligent machines can't do? What really is the fundamental purpose of being human? And maybe the fundamental purpose of being human is to spread into the solar system, aided by these artificial intelligence that will enable us to do that safely and at proper speeds and so on, that actually make it all feasible. Maybe our purpose is to populate the solar system and then to populate the near reaches of the universe. Maybe we discover that's our purpose, and not machines, but actual us pieces of meat that go do that. Um, and to me, that's I'm attracted. I grew up as a kid in the initial space era, so I do get attracted to that kind of future. The world, even though it's full of conflict, the world of the expanse and that kind of thing, where we've developed machines that enable human beings to move quickly about and enable us to expand further into the universe. To me, that's a really intriguing and attractive future. It doesn't happen without an artificially intelligent machines. You got to have really smart machines that can do all kinds of things for you. So hopefully those things can happen together. I don't.
Where
I
does where does technological unemployment fit within this picture? Because
mm,
technological unemployment is in a way within the relationship between humans and
yeah,
machines.
yeah. I think of it in two ways. Number one, I think there's probably countless untold things that human beings could be doing that we are unable to do because we're too busy making livings. So technological unemployment would enable us to discover what those things are. And maybe it's just going on more wilderness hikes. I don't know what it is. I like to go on wilderness hikes, and
I
maybe
love it. I love it.
yeah.
Me
So
and my wife, we
maybe
meet the sunrise every morning at 5 o'clock. We wake
oh
up
my
no matter
gosh,
the weather, no matter minus 40, hail,
Wow. Good for
rainstorm,
you.
snow. Every morning we're out and we're meeting the sunrise.
Wow. Wow. That's fantastic. Congratulations on that. My in our family, my wife is up meeting the sunrise in the living room where we have an eastern view of the sunrise, such as it is in Seattle, occasionally glorious and often gloomy. Uh, yeah, where I tend to be more of a night person and a little less of a morning person, but that's an admirable thing that you're doing. Um, uh, back to technology. My I would love to have artificially intelligent robots of science fiction realm, assuming that they're controllable. I don't. I tend not to. I don't get caught up in, as some of the leading technologists do, worrying that there'll be a robot rebellion and a replacement of us. I think that they could be. I assume. I guess my positive side assumes that they could be designed in such a way, and will be designed in such a way that they never achieve the Schwarzenegger level of what was his films.
Terminator,
Yeah, to the Terminator films,
Rise of the
where
Machines.
the rise of the machines, where they terminate us. I just have to assume that there's a way to unplug or develop them in such a way that that doesn't happen.
So you
Um,
don't agree with
I,
Elon that they're an existential threat?
I I tend not to. No, one discounts. This is not always the most popular view, but my opinion is one discounts an Elon Musk opinion at your peril, because he has tended to be right about many things, not everything. Apparently, not about the pandemic, as far as we can tell. Um,
Not
uh, but
about
uh, but
self-driving
uh,
cars either, by the way.
but not about self-driving cars. But I still see them in. If you go back to we've only really been at this for 8 or 10 years. That's not a very long time to be working on self-driving cars. It's an incredibly complex problem. Driving down freeways, easy. Driving complex road systems in Canada or the US that weren't built for autonomous cars, very, very hard problem. And we may never quite get there, but given that we're so early in that process and the capacity of the machines both to see and to think is still relatively rudimentary compared Ray Kurzweil to where it will be in 2028 or 2030. I still think we might get there. The idea of artificial intelligence or other technology leading to technological unemployment. One of my mentors was Robert Theobald. And nobody even knows his name anymore, but he was an early 1970s futurist. Wrote many, many things, but there's a wonderful little audio recording of him, which you can find on the internet, of him explaining why we needed to have a guaranteed annual income in about 1971.
Wow.
Because he said there's a technological revolution underway, and there's going to come a day when the machines will do most of the work, and human beings need to survive, and so we need to invent and begin to implement a guaranteed annual income for everybody. And I was there. I was a college senior, I suppose, about when he was saying that, and so I've never forgotten that. And he stuck. I was around him a lot. Did some major projects with him in the 70s and 80s, and that was one of his ultimate themes. Is that's where we needed to head in order to provide a just and livable society. So I don't know that's inevitable because we're not necessarily smart about these things, but it certainly is a possible future, and it ought to be a preferred future that we figure out how to provide a guaranteed annual income. I can also remember a Nova special or something that Alvin Toffler did in the early days of the industrial robot revolution, and he was in Japan, and he was in. A guy who had purchased a painting robot, and the robot could paint all kinds of things. And he said, and his example was the Japanese owner of this robot was on the golf course playing golf all the time, while his robot was painting things. And he said that this is the future. The robots will do the work, we will play, and we have to just figure out how to provide an income to the people that don't own the robots as well. I think that's a preferred future. I do hope we figure that out. And there are some interesting experiments. I understand it. I'm not intimately familiar with them going on around the world, even right now, around guaranteed annual income.
Well, the pandemic sort of released a number of those all over the world. So in Canada, we have this thing called CRB, which I'm not sure if it's not COVID rescue benefit or something, or COVID
Probably is. That's
recovery
probably the right term.
benefit,
Yeah.
something like that, which is $2,000 per month. And I think 7 to 8 million Canadians, which out of a population out of, 35, 6 million people, is probably, 18%, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. 20% of Canadians roughly are getting that. They
There you
have
go.
been getting it since probably April, May, maybe May, I think, and they will be getting it until next summer.
Yeah, it's
So
that's a
that's kind
brilliant
of like guaranteed minimum income right there.
yeah, it's that's action research in action, basically. There were proposals for that in the states. This being the states, of course, we didn't do that, but we should have. We'd be. That's one of the reasons that COVID is out of control here, because people have to work, and it was a huge policy mistake. Um, and so kudos to you in Canada for doing that, and it'll be interesting to look back sociologically as this experiment comes to an end and ask, so did it ruin everybody's lives? Did they all become hobos? Uh, all the arguments against guaranteed annual income. Um, we'll know more. We'll know more about that here in a year or two.
Yeah, by
And
next summer, you would say, look at those Canadians. We don't want to end up like them, do we?
yeah. But I doubt it. Um, it's like the programs to provide housing for homeless people. They find that if you provide them with housing rather than not providing it, everything gets better.
So, okay. So let me ask you this then, and that's kind of the last sort of topic
Yeah.
here with respect, and then we'll bring our conversation to the end. But what about the pandemic? Because we talked about sort of the
Yes.
sociological and political situation. We talked about the technological situation. We even mentioned the possibility of civil war. What about the pandemic? You're a futurist. That's a pressing crisis. What is the possible, probable, and preferred future with respect to that?
Oh, that's pretty simple. But let's back up one step. How did we miss it?
I was gonna say that, but I thought I'd take it easy
Yeah.
on you this time.
Yeah, because I was asked many times, and I think you saw you found a video of me saying it's one of the most common questions I was asked in the late 1990s and through this century was, what are the possibilities that there will be a global pandemic, a virus, or something of some kind that would wipe out human civilization? And my answer always was, not possible. And the reason I would say that is that the scientific community and the communications among the scientific community in the age of the internet had reached a stage at which when a new pandemic level threat arose, it would be attacked so vigorously and in such a coordinated global way that it would be almost impossible, not ever impossible, but almost impossible to get out of control. And of course we had some examples of that. We had the SARS, and we had what was the one that originated in Africa that just came back? We've
Ebola.
had, yeah, Ebola. Um, we've had Ebola, and those were highly threatening diseases, but controlled pretty quickly and quite well because of this very high level of scientific cooperation and government cooperation around the world in tackling them. And so, what I say about the this current coronavirus pandemic is it was the most predicted event, perhaps in human history, because from Bill Gates to graduate students in future studies programs to
I
to the
watch
World Health
videos from the early
Organization.
2000s. Experts in
Yeah,
the field were predicting
yeah,
it.
saying this is coming.
Yeah.
It's going to happen. We have to be ready for it. There were, as we all know, there were plans written. There's the famous book that the Obama administration handed over to the Trump administration, which was then thrown in the trash. This is what you do if there's a threat of a pandemic. And so it was the most predicted, but in some ways still the least prepared for. And the predictions got one thing wrong, and therefore we weren't prepared for it. And that is, nobody imagined that the governments, and in particular the US government, would ignore it. And not only ignore it, try to cover it up. And so that's the problem with the pandemic. Now, in retrospect, we should have anticipated this because after this pandemic started, I went back. I saw a reference to this from Elise Boulding, and so I went and got the book by Daniel Defoe. It's called Journal of My Plague Year, and you might be familiar with it. And he wrote it. He was a child during the plague year of 1664-65, I believe it was, in London. And he wrote this book then later as an adult, kind of remembering what it was as though he was an adult at the time. And what immediately hit me in reading the first 50 pages of that book where the first impulse of the government in London was to deny it and to cover it up, to say, no, the plague isn't back. It's not really happening. And so all the scenario planners should have built into the scenarios that the first impulse of even a government like the United States would be to deny, to cover it up, and to ignore it. But we didn't. So now here we are. So the probable future is, assuming the transition happens here, the U.S. rejoins the World Health Organization, assuming the science that we're hearing about is correct, that we'll have one or more successful vaccines, and they're already being pre-produced thanks to the Bill Gates Foundation and some others. That vaccination will begin next year, and that by 2 years from now, this will be a rearview mirror. Though it may still always be a threat, it might still always exist in some corners of the world and be a threat to you if you're not vaccinated and not otherwise immune. So that is the probable future, and that's really, really good news. The other part of the probable future, according to Larry Brilliant, the epidemiologist who led the final eradication of smallpox, is that given the size of the human population and our intermixing now with other species in their habitats at a much greater level than ever existed before in history, we are likely to see additional pandemics over the next 2 or 3 decades, or at least attempted breakouts of pandemics. So that's probable as well. The possible future is it'll get out of control again. We'll forget the lesson as soon as we've learned it. That's a possible future. But the preferred future is that we remember the lesson that we learned on this time about what happens if you don't respond quickly and openly and transparently. This also is a bit of a criticism of China. We don't know precisely everything that happened in China because China is China. But we it appears that their first impulse as well was to deny and cover up for at least a short period of time. And so we have to sort of build that into our scenarios, but have a preferred future in which governments don't do that. And we have a much more robust government and global World Health Organization, other global organization responses to any future pandemic threat that emerges. And so we don't go through this again. Sadly, one more thought is that another probable future is that will be true for a generation or maybe a generation and a half. And then everybody will forget. Particularly, if we're successful each time in tamping them down, then everybody will forget that it was really bad. And our great grandchildren will face a pandemic and they'll say, wait a minute, where did this come from? How come we weren't prepared for this? Because over generations, we forget the lessons of history, no matter how effectively those histories are written. So that's my thought on the pandemic. Hope that covers it.
Yeah, and speaking of how we missed it, it reminds me again to Arthur C. Clarke's Three Laws of Prediction, where he says the first one is that when a distinguished but elderly scientist states that something is possible, he's almost certainly right, but when he states that something is impossible, he's also almost certainly wrong. And so that kind of
Yeah.
reminded me when
Yeah.
I was looking at that clip of you in
Yeah.
2015.
That's really good. Yeah, I remember the Ed Lindemann, my original mentors, the way he actually said it. I talked about this a little bit before, but I wasn't remembering his exact statement. He what he would say would be, everything that's possible today was at one time impossible,
Yeah.
and therefore that inevitably means that everything that's considered impossible today may at some time in the future be possible. Now, when he was saying that, to him that meant including traveling to another solar system. Um, but it means, it can be applied to all kinds of domains.
Right, and going to the pandemic and the possible and the probable, I was reading actually a couple of days ago about a mink outbreak of coronavirus in Denmark,
I
and
saw that.
if the reports were accurate, it was a mutation of the virus which was not susceptible to the at least most of the corona vaccines being developed right now. So if it were to jump back into humans, that could have some serious implications with respect to the vaccines we're working on right now.
Yeah. So although some of the vaccines, as we know, are those RNA vaccines that are much more that you can decode a mutated version of the virus, decode it, and develop a new RNA vaccine fairly quickly, conceptually at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're in a scientific position where it might be possible to respond pretty quickly. But the problem is, and this is Larry Brilliant's point, who worked on the smallpox eradication. He said producing, scientifically conceptualizing and producing the vaccine is in some ways the simplest step.
Yeah, it's hard, but it's not the hardest part.
That's exactly right. That's a better way to say it. Hard, but not the hardest part. The hardest part is organizing the global system in a cooperative way in the bifurcated, conflicting world that we have, so that you can vaccinate or make safe, 8+ billion people, and that's the challenge.
Right, and it's actually not bifurcated anymore because it was bifurcated in the Cold War.
You're wrong term. Wrong
But
term. Yeah.
right now it's multi sort of
Multi.
pronged.
Yeah. What's the term for
Yeah.
what's the multiple of bifurcated? Whatever that term is.
Well, decentralized and more kind of chaotic, if you will. That's why.
Well, it's that favorite term of VUCA that a lot of people use.
Right.
Volatile, uncertain. What's the C?
Complex.
Complex, but also chaotic. Whenever I see that, I think that the word should be chaotic, and ambiguous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the world.
Right.
We're in, but and it's not a good world for dealing with pandemics.
Absolutely, but unfortunately, our problems are many and numerous, and we're going to have to figure out how to navigate through them. The pandemic is among the smallest ones of them, perhaps.
Yes, I agree. But it's a nice little test case for the number one global problem that you and I talked about earlier in our conversation today, which was to somehow achieve a level of global cooperation to deal with these otherwise large challenges, and that is their prerequisite. And whether that's a new set of institutions, or whether that's better use of the institutions that we have, combined with the compassion that you talked about from the Dalai Lama, that's the game. That's the ball game in the 21st century.
Yeah, in a way, it's like a general rehearsal, if you will, because it could have been a lot worse. Our future problems would be a lot bigger and a lot worse.
Yes.
And so this is like a general rehearsal. And if we fail the rehearsal, then kind of forget about the bigger issues, the actual performance. But if we succeed here, we can learn even from our mistakes, and then we can have better chance to resolve the bigger issues.
Absolutely.
Glenn, we've been talking for over 2 hours, so unfortunately I can talk to you forever. But let me ask you this: where can people find more about you and your work for anyone who wants to follow you more closely?
It's very simple. Futurist.com.
Futurist.com.
Futurist.com. Just come to futurist.com. From there, they can track me. They can find me on social media under my name and all the various social media platforms. But the best place is to come to futurist.com. Is the best place to contact me.
And what's the best way? And what's the best way to send people off then? What's the one perhaps most important single message that you want to send us away with?
So if I had a final message, which I share with all kinds of audiences and clients that I've worked with over the years, is this: the future is not something that just happens to us. The future is something that we do. There are things that happen in the world and in the future that we have no control over and that we have to adjust to. But to a very large degree, we do make choices that create the future based on our images. So the question is, what's that image? The future is not something that just happens to us. It's something that we do. So ultimately, the question is, what future do we want? That's the message.
Wow, I love that. Glen Hiemstra, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Great conversation. Appreciate everything that you're doing. These are really great conversations that you've done. Thank you very much.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.